So this is the Sony ZV-E1, and it's like a hybrid mashup between the Sony a7S III and like some futuristic vlogging camera. And I was absolutely stoked to get it because I'm someone who uses the S3 and is qualified as like a creator. But after a few days putting it to the test, I started to question whether this formula really works in real life. And we'll get back to the Hummer EV in a second because right now I've got somewhere better to put this to the test.
It's a 2023 Daytona 200, and race action is got underway.
So I am at the Daytona 200, which is probably one of the coolest places to be able to test out this camera. And basically I'm a one-man show, so ideally the perfect customer for this camera right now. I've got the full rig for being able to shoot stuff, but this is going to be perfect for behind the scenes, capturing all of that stuff, so we'll see how it goes. So the race is about to start. So far the camera's been pretty good. It did kind of overheat on me once, but I did have it out in the sun a little bit. It wasn't recording, so I kind of put it back in my bag, and hopefully that helps a little bit. The race is about to start, so I need 3 cameras going for this, because it's going to be cool. So if I was to try and simplify this camera as much as possible, it's basically like an a7S III on the inside, thrown into this more compact, kind of mid-grade-ish body with very little attention paid to photography. So what this means is that it's going to be a little bit more purpose-built for video than a lot of other cameras we've been seeing in this price range. So while yes, you can still shoot photos with this, there are going to be a few limitations with that. Now, what surprised me the most is actually on the video side. So there are some massive new features, even above what the Sony a7S III has, to the point where it's actually pretty easy to say that no other full frame camera in this price range even comes close to matching these video specs and features. All right, so let's jump into the hardware, and this is actually going to be pretty important because this is probably one of the major differences between like the E1 and a bigger camera like the a7S III, which a lot of the internals of this are based off of. And as I see it, there are a lot of trade-offs, maybe major trade-offs, but it's possible that you might even see these as improvements. So hang with me. The first is that it is a much smaller and lighter camera, and it's actually noticeably lighter when you just compare the bodies by themselves. I find that once you kind of load things up, so once you insert the batteries and load it up with a lens and filter and everything like that, it's going to be a bit less extreme. It's also smaller too in every direction, and where you notice it the most is going to be this height, and that's going to be the first trade-off. There is no viewfinder on this camera. I have a little mic right here, but if I take that off, there is no viewfinder at all on this camera. I really don't use a viewfinder much for video. Usually if I do, it's just to check exposure, since Sony screens are not the best quality. But being that it's smaller means that there are also a few hardware differences from the a7S III or even like the a7 IV. So there is no joystick on the back of this camera. There's one card slot. There's no mode dial or anything at the top. And the HDMI port is going to be a micro HDMI. Plus you lose a lot of dials. So you lose the exposure compensation dial and the front dial. Now, if you're upgrading from like a Sony a6000 camera, or maybe even like a ZV camera, you are not gonna notice this that much. And honestly, if you're using this mostly as like a vlogging or BTS style camera, giving up some of that like A7 style hardware for a camera that's cheaper and smaller and lighter is probably gonna be worth it. Now, the only thing that really continues to bug me the most is these metal tabs sticking out of the camera. I seriously cannot find a good comfortable way of holding this camera with my finger on the shutter button without these kind of digging into my hand. It's like this on a couple other cameras. I don't notice the ergonomics as much on the smaller ZV cameras, but this one's fairly large with some bigger lenses on it, so I notice it the most. It's one of the more uncomfortable cameras, and I don't think it had to be because this is an entirely new body. But we do have some hardware upgrades as well. So there are a few things that Sony is doing to make this even better. Probably the biggest one is going to be the hot shoe, which can now accept their mics, their digital audio signal. And then we also have 3 mics built into this. And actually one of the more ingenious solutions right here. So there's 3 internal mic capsules, I believe, inside of this. And you can actually choose directional ability on this. But the way that this windscreen attaches to the hot shoe, man, this is freaking genius.
Alright, so the race is like halfway done right now. I'm using the camera a lot, but really just for its intended purpose, like as a vlogging style camera. I also try to use it for stills, but the lack of a shutter means it's pretty much useless out here. So it serves its purpose. I just wish it did something more other than a very expensive but very good vlogging style camera.
Now what you're going to get with the ZV-E1 is going to be specs and features that just nothing else at this price point can match. So again, think of like Sony a7S III specs in here, and really nothing is being held back. In fact, you actually get a few features on this camera that are not in the a7S III. So this is a 12 megapixel full frame sensor. You get 4K up to 120 frames per second with a full pixel readout, although 4K 60 is the only thing that's available at launch, and I'm told the 4K 120 is coming very soon. So you can also shoot full 10-bit 422. You have all-eye recording, H.265 or H.264. I'm guessing 4K 120 might be a little bit limited because and that might be why it's not ready at launch, because the a7S III needs CF Express in order to shoot at 4K 120 in all-eye, and this camera only has an SD card slot. Obviously, you still get 1080p, and that's actually going to go up to 240 frames per second, which is pretty insane for a full-frame camera. And actually, this is going to be one of the best 1080p cameras. If you want to know why, I'll actually be dropping a video on this shortly. So subscribe while you're at it, guys. I really appreciate the thumbs up. And I am putting together a list, I actually have it in the description below, of my favorite lenses and accessories for the E1, so check that out. And I do literally try and respond to every comment you guys give me, so hit me up with your thoughts if you have any questions on this. Now, the big benefit we all know and love about the S3 sensor is you get insanely good low light performance. So I'm using my S3 at like 25,000 ISO all the time, and it still looks absolutely amazing. This camera can basically see in the dark, and you're getting that with the ZV-E1. You do have all the picture profiles as well, including like S-Cinetone, you have S-Log, and actually if you're shooting in log, you still have the dual ISO from the S3, so you have 800 ISO and 12,800 ISO. So you can literally shoot log video at 12,800 ISO, and it is barely noisier than the base 800 ISO. So there's just a ton of situations where having that kind of dual ISO, it's not technically dual ISO, but it's pretty close. It just gives you so much room to push this camera in low light that it's just an invaluable feature to me. There's also going to be very little rolling shutter, and the quality on this camera is just exceptional. So you basically, this is a professional level quality camera. Absolutely crazy frame rates. You have the best low light performance in virtually any camera. So already this camera is looking absolutely amazing. There's also some pretty insane feature upgrades. So this camera has the 5-axis image stabilization system, and in my opinion, it's not the greatest when compared to like Canon and Panasonic, but Sony does have an active stabilization mode, which does add a crop, but stabilization is noticeably better in this mode, so I highly recommend it. Keep in mind, you cannot use that at 4K 120 though, so 4K 60 is going to be the limit for the active mode. But now you have a dynamic active mode, which again, it does add more of a crop, actually a decent addition to the crop factor, but it does give you some digital stabilization. And in all of my tests so far, it actually does a pretty good job and it looks like it's going to be one of the best for digital stabilization. You also get the focus breathing compensation, which is one thing that should be on all Sony cameras. It's actually not on the S3, but Sony has been horrible with firmware upgrades lately. So I don't know what's going on the last few years from them, but I do want that on all of my cameras, Sony. Let's get to it. You also, kind of interesting, you get a zoom rocker on the front of this. So if you're using this with a lens with zoom motors like this 16-35 f4, you can actually control it from that. You also can actually load in custom LUTs straight into the camera, and there is finally in-camera time-lapse creation, which has been a long time coming. So not just an intervalometer, you can actually create your entire time-lapse in camera if you want to. Now also the entire menu structure is going to be just way more touch friendly, and there are a lot of new AI features that kind of bounce between gimmicky and useful. It really depends on the situation, but I'll break those down. So the first is multiple face recognition. This is definitely going to be one of the more gimmicky ones because first of all, you have to be in full auto in order to use this. And actually in the example that we were shown from Sony, the camera was set to 1080p, 30 frames per second at a shutter of 1/30th at f10 and 1600 ISO. So if you are okay with those settings, this feature might be okay for you. But basically the camera will adjust the aperture to make sure that all of the faces inside of the frame are going to be tack sharp. So if you have this set to like 1.4 and someone else comes into the frame, it'll adjust that aperture to f8, f11, something like that, in order to make sure that everybody's face is going to be tack sharp. Now the next is cinematic vlog. I'm definitely going to put this in the more gimmicky category, but it's actually a cool concept. Basically, you just hit a button and the camera changes a bunch of settings to look more cinematic. The problem is only a few of these are customizable and some of them are just a little bit weird. Now the features are getting better, so stay with me, although major crops are going to be needed for these next few features. So you can add something called framing stabilizer, which basically uses the digital stabilization system, but allows you to actually keep your subject in the exact position you want it. And it can do it either in the center of the frame, or you can program it to keep your subject in any area of the frame. So you can keep it in the corner or frame it however you want. Literally, the camera will stabilize while maintaining your subject inside of the frame. It also worked with any subject the autofocus system could identify. So products, people, even with cars, it seemed to work at pretty much everything I threw at it. So one of the probably least gimmicky features is going to be this. It's called auto framing, and basically the camera is right now on a tripod, but it is tracking me around the frame. And this is a look I would go to all the time, but usually I would need a camera operator in order to get it. And now you can get it as a single camera operator just in front of the camera. Really easy to set up. Technically you can do this kind of stuff in post, but I see a lot of use for just being able to do this straight out of camera, and this is a really useful way to do it. Now all of these crops will introduce a bit of an issue, so a little bit of warning, it's going to get just a bit nerdy right now. All of these features that use a crop, they do crop in quite a bit, like up to a 1.5 times crop into the frame. This is not small at all, and you will absolutely notice a difference in quality. You do have a few settings that you can use to customize this, especially with the auto framing feature. And you can change the crop level with that, but obviously this is going to change how much the camera can actually track you inside the frame. So the whole value of this goes down the less of a crop that it does. Now the more nerdy part is that this really only applies if you shoot 4K. And this is going to be why. So this camera uses a fairly low resolution 12 megapixel sensor. And that's going to mean that basically every pixel is going to be used for 4K video. So anytime you have to crop, it's going to be a digital crop and you're going to be losing information. Now, if the camera had a higher resolution sensor like the A7 IV and was oversampling, this probably wouldn't be the case. But if you shoot 1080p on the E1 or even the S3, the camera does oversample. So even with these digital crops, the camera is just resampling the pixels that it does have. So I really couldn't notice the difference between all of these crop modes when I was in 1080p. So if you need to shoot 4K like I do, use these modes with a little bit of caution. Now, autofocus is also going to be a pretty major upgrade, even compared to like the A7S III, because it uses the newer AI processing system, which actually has a ton of different subjects that it can track and process, and it does a much better job in like predictive tracking of the subject's motion. And I know I've only had this camera for about like a week, but these features actually came out in the A7R5, and I've had that camera for a little while now. So in my tests, it's just much less likely to be confused with other objects. So basically, if you tell it you're going to focus on a human, it's not going to focus on something else unless it absolutely can't find a human in the frame. And my only issue with it is that you actually have to pick the subject that you're going to be focusing on. So if you want to go from like shooting people to cars, you have to actually tell the camera in order to take advantage of this system. There's no like auto subject detect that's going to automatically switch it from people to cars by itself, depending on what it detects in the frame. Otherwise, I'm a huge fan of his autofocus system, and it's going to be a really big step up from Sony's older cameras like the A7 III and like the A6400 and A6600, kind of that generation from a couple years ago. Now, I do think Sony made two mistakes with this camera. So the first is going to be that there's no mechanical shutter on this camera at all. It is only going to be electronic shutter. And I get that this is pretty much purposely built for video and you don't need a shutter for video, but even on my A7S III, I'll occasionally want to grab an image without having to grab a second camera. And the sensor read speeds on these are actually very fast, but they are far from instant. This is not like a stacked CMOS sensor camera. So if you do have fast moving subjects, if you're panning while shooting, you can see rolling shutter. And if you're in bad artificial lighting, you might see some banding, some flicker and stuff like that as well. Now, what I wish they had done instead is use at least a mechanical second curtain, like what Canon did with the R8, which at least would have allowed you to shoot faster moving subjects or like bad artificial lighting without being completely worried about ruining the shot. Now, the other issue on this is going to be overheating, and pause. I know I've done some overheating videos before. I live in Florida. We get some bright sunlight and a lot of humidity, which these cameras hate. But actually, I first overheated this camera the night I unboxed it while just sitting on the couch. I was literally just going through the menu systems. It was hooked up to a monitor, but I didn't even record any video. This was just me just setting up the camera, and the overheating limit was set to high, and the camera completely overheated on me. So this scared me. I did do a few tests, and the good news is I have been getting over an hour consistently at 4K 24 when indoors. But if you want to use this outside in the heat for any length of time, especially if you're recording 4K 60. I think Sony officially quotes like 30 minutes of 4K 60 recording, but that's going to be at 72 degrees indoors. So granted, we are in direct sunlight right now, but the camera actually only got about 5 minutes of 4K 60 recording before it overheated on me. That's just a little low in my opinion for a camera this powerful. And the reason is that this camera is much smaller than like the A7S III, and it doesn't have the same heat dissipation system. So most people will be fine, even if you're shooting long takes indoors. But if you're out in the sun or the heat, especially with 4K 60, you're not going to get a ton of time out of this, and that might be an issue. So should you actually go out and buy this camera? This is actually a very easy question to answer, and also a very difficult one. So if the limitations and the price of this camera are not a deterrent for you, you're basically getting an A7S III with performance and frame rates. You're getting a bunch of extra features, actually purpose-built for mobile content creation, and you're doing it for a lot less money than any other camera that can do all of this. And at this kind of lightweight size, using the E1 on small gimbals like the DJI RS3 Mini that just came out is going to be absolutely perfect. Plus, Sony has really been making some lightweight lenses that just fit this camera so well. So I'll actually post a link to all of my favorite gear for this camera below, but like the new 50mm f1.4, even this 16-35 f4 with the electronic zoom, these lenses are just purpose and perfectly built for a camera like this. Plus you have like the Tamron 28-75, Sigma 24-70 f2.8. I can't say enough about how much easier it is to recommend a camera when you have lenses that are actually perfect for it. And yes, that's a knock at Canon, who still doesn't allow third-party lenses at all, but I do think that there's two fairly major limitations with this camera that might be big for you. So this is not a camera for you if you also need to shoot stills, unless you also have a second body for that. And I don't recommend this for anyone who needs to shoot like longer record times or use it for more professional shoots where things like a single card slot and overheating, those might be an issue for you there. And I even wonder if Sony's new AI features would have been a better fit in a camera with more resolution to be able to crop in to that 4K and still have enough pixels to not lose quality. Plus, it would have given us a little bit more use for that occasional photo that even video creators sometimes need to get. So while there's a lot to love about this camera, it really ended up feeling a bit more limited in just how I could use it. And it ended up as like a B or a C camera for me, or I was just using it for vlogging and BTS. And honestly, that might be a bit restrictive for a camera this expensive. But definitely let me know what you guys think of the new ZV-E1. Maybe this is the perfect camera for you. Let me know in the comments below. Definitely like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Hope you guys are doing amazing. I've got a ton of stuff coming up soon, so I'll see you soon in a new video.